Hi everyone, I'm Cheryl Mahoney and I'm the author of the Guardian of the Opera trilogy. And it's launch day. It is finally June 5th. It might even have been yesterday if I don't get this video up until tomorrow. And that means that Guardian of the Opera Book 1, Nocturne, is now available to purchase. I've been talking about this for a very, very long time. I've been thinking about it for even longer, and I am so excited that it's now available for you to buy and read, and I certainly hope enjoy. So you can find it by doing a search on Amazon. This is the hardback copy. There is also the paperback and the Kindle that is available on Amazon if you just look for it with the book and my name, Cheryl Mahoney. Or you can go to my blog, marveloustales.com, and there are plenty of links to point you in the right direction. So I hope you'll check it out. And this is my virtual recorded launch party presentation. I would normally do a launch party in person, but pandemic, so we're all socially isolating, which I think the Phantom would in fact approve of. Meg would like to have a party, but the Phantom would not. So maybe it works out. So I am doing a recorded video of the presentation I probably would have given if we were in person. And I guess that works out. If you don't happen to live near me, you get to watch it. And if you can't make it at the particular time, you get to watch it. So, I don't know if it's win-win, but there are wins from the situation. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the book. I'm going to read an excerpt from it for you. And then I'm going to do some Q&A. I don't have anyone literally here asking questions, but questions have been asked, and I'm going to go ahead and give the answers for them. So let's jump in. One of the things I really wanted to share about, because I think it's kind of wild and weird, was the process for how I ended up writing this, because it is a more complicated one than any of my other books. People often ask, how long did it take to write this, and where did the idea first come from, and what is it like when you write a book from first idea to publishing? And usually it's not that complicated. I mean, I get the idea from somewhere, I write it, often as National Novel Writing Month, I do my first draft, do some revision, get it out to publishing. It's like maybe 2 years from first idea to it's actually out there and people can get it. That's not how it happened with this one. So Nocturne is a Phantom of the Opera retelling. So I really have to start with how I met the Phantom of the Opera. And that happened when I was 18. That's 15 years ago. You can do the math on my age if you really want to. And a friend loaned me Gaston Leroux's Phantom and the Weber soundtrack. So I really started with the two big ones. I mean, Leroux created the story. Weber is the powerhouse version. There's no way to deny that. And he's a good version, so it's not a problem that he's the powerhouse version, just to be clear and respectful to Sir Andrew. So I met the Phantom with both of those versions at once. I also had a friend who was actually writing a Phantom sequel, and she was like sharing pages with us at lunch during high school. It was really fun. And that kind of introduced me to the Phantom fandom world a little bit more. So that was the beginning. I pretty soon after that, I feel like within 6 months, a year, I decided to write my own sequel. It was different from my friends. It was a different angle on it, but it was really pretty much what happened after the end of the original Phantom story. I don't want to say too much about the original. Maybe you're watching this video and don't know the story, so I may be a little bit vague in places. We'll see. But the genesis, the idea for me in particular, was really the character of Meg Giry. She's a pretty small role in Leroux, but she is there as a ballet dancer at the opera, and her mother is the Phantom of the Opera's box keeper. In Weber and also in some other versions, she's Christine's friend. And I started thinking, well, here's a character who is sort of next to the main events of the story. It's not exactly, it's not her story usually, but she has a really interesting view of the story because her mother, as the Phantom's box keeper, is often more sympathetic to the Phantom, or at least knows more about him than really anybody else. Christine, obviously, very involved with the Phantom. Meg's going to be hearing about some of that. She's going to know some of what's going on. What does she think about all of this? So that story I wrote when I was 18, I call it a story. I think it was 90,000 to 100,000 words. It was a solid novel length. It was a sequel, and it was about what happened afterwards when Meg and the Phantom are both still at the opera and what happens next. So I wrote that. I did some revision on that. I put it away on my shelf and thought that was the end of the story for this particular story. Double stories. I'd totally edit that out if I was writing this down, but that's okay. We'll keep going. And I never really thought I was going to go anywhere farther with it. I wrote it during my basically senior year of high school, freshman year of college, and then I moved on to other things. I started writing some pirate fiction for a while, and then I started into the Beyond the Tales quartet, which I have since published. You can find those on my blog or on Amazon, by the way. But the Phantom story never quite left my head. The Phantom never did quite leave. Meg never quite left. And I kept thinking about them. And I kept thinking of new aspects of the character, of the story, new things. I was watching and reading a lot of other versions of the story. I've done separate videos about all of those versions. So if you're quite curious, you can go find that out. The short version is probably that Susan Kay, Charles Dance, and Terry Pratchett are the three best I would recommend. And Weber, of course. I've seen Weber's play many times as well. It all gave me new thoughts. It gave me new ideas. And then I want to say about 6 to 8 years ago, I didn't write this down. I didn't make a note to know exactly when this happened. But 6 to 8 years ago, so about 6 to 8 years after I thought I was done with all of this, I decided to just write a scene. I had an idea about a scene and I just write it down just for fun. It was just a little side diversion thing. It wasn't supposed to be important. It was actually what is now chapter 1 of Nocturne. And Meg gets lost at the opera house. She's 12 years old. She just arrived. She ends up meeting the Phantom and he helps her find her way. And that's really the scene that I wrote and that is now chapter 1, because I had thought about this a lot in the intervening years, and that was not something that was ever in my original version. It never happened. That wasn't part of the story. I mean, the story started later, but also that was not in the history. I never thought about it. And once I wrote that scene, once I had that idea in my head, it really became the first domino of the chain that then impacted a lot of things and alters how everything else fits, because it changes Meg's impression of the Phantom. Because she doesn't think he's as scary, she encourages her mother to become his box keeper. And because her mother is his box keeper, she knows a little more about the Phantom, has some sort of entrances into, this is part of why she gets to know Christine, in fact. There's a lot of pieces that end up stemming from that first scene. But I thought I was just writing one scene. And then I was like, well, maybe I'll do this for NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month. I'll just kind of write a quick, just for fun draft, just to get some of these new ideas I've had about the story down. And that'll be all. So I put it away. I wasn't going to work on it until November, but I had an idea for another scene, and it was really clear in my head, and it ended up being a scene that is in book 2. When you read that eventually, you will know it. It is on the rooftop. There are tangerines. You will recognize it when you get to it. I won't say more to avoid spoilers. So I'll just write that scene down, because I have it in my head and I don't want to forget it by November. So I'll just write that scene down. And then I wrote another scene down, and then another scene down. And pretty soon I was like, this is really fun. And I don't want to just sort of rush through this in November. For those who don't know National Novel Writing Month, the idea is you write an entire novel in 1 month. And I decided I didn't want to do it that way. I wanted to spend more time on this because this was just a fun thing to be doing. So it ended up that the Phantom story became my kind of break, recreation writing, in between writing other things. So I'd be spending some months revising The Wanderers for my Beyond the Tales quartet. And, that was a lot of really focused revising, and I'm going to take a break from that. I'm going to just write random Phantom scenes for a month or 2. And then I'll go back and work on my next book. And then I'll take a break and do some more Phantom. And this went on for years until I had a huge body of scenes. some put together, mostly put together in some kind of order. I will, just to make that clear, I was writing it out of order because it was whatever scene kind of came to mind, I would write down. I do not normally write my books that way. Normally, I write from the beginning to the end, and I may end up coming back and like inserting scenes later, but basically I'm writing it in order because that's how I'm figuring out the story. I have some idea of where I'm going, but I'm figuring out the details as I go. That's not how it was for The Phantom. But partially it's because I knew these characters so well. I knew this story so well. I thought about it for so much time. I could write something that would not come into play until, as it turns out, book 3. But it works when I get there. Things have not changed so much as I figured out the earlier parts out. It worked. And I knew these characters so well that I could like look at a scene with, well, let's just say 2 characters. All right, spoilers. Meg and the Phantom, Eric, eventually reconnect. They have a lot of scenes together later in the trilogy, not really in book 1, but later in the trilogy. And I could write a random scene of the 2 of them talking, and I have a feeling someone else would think it could go anywhere in book 2 or 3. And I'm like, no, it has to be here in the timeline. It can't be here earlier because they wouldn't be having this topic. They wouldn't be interacting like this at this earlier point. It would have to be here, that's later. And this other scene would have to be slightly before it. And this scene would have to be slightly after. And it's just them talking. I mean, there are plot connections and things, but the point I'm trying to make is I really knew these characters, so I could do it this way. That's not normally how I write. So pretty soon I have a massive pile, I mean, it was a Word document, but a massive pile of scenes, metaphorically speaking. And I did finally do the Phantom story for National Novel Writing Month, several years after I originally thought I might, because I'm like, I need to finally just write the last pieces of this to try to complete the entire thing, because I've got these holes and I'm at the point where I really do have to pull it together. So I wrote 50,000 words. I really did not know how much I had left. I thought it could be 30,000, it could be 70,000. It ended up being 50,000, which is NaNoWriMo's goal. And then I had a complete story from the beginning to the end. I think I did not mention that I originally thought this was going to be 1 book. Then as it got bigger and bigger, I thought it would be 2 books. And then I had a friend, my writer friend Kelly, in fact, who said, well, the length you're talking about, it could be 3 books. And I'm like, no, it's not a trilogy. No, it's 2 books at most. Once I finally had it all together and looked at it scene by scene, I was like, oh, it's a trilogy. So then I spent more time revising to make each book work on its own. It's very much a connected story. I don't really recommend reading book 2 or 3 without reading the earlier books. I mean, I guess you could. I try to put enough information in there that you won't be totally lost, but it is meant to be read in order. But each book is its own book now. So all of that finally led to book 1 is out. The good news for you, I think, is that it took a long time to get here, but this means that book 2 and 3 are going to be out very soon. By the end of the year is my plan. Knock on wood pulp. Things happen, but that is the goal. So you'll be able to read books 2 and 3 pretty soon. But that's how we got here. It's strange, it's crazy, it's kind of labyrinthine, like the Opera Garnier. And I haven't even told you all the pieces of it. I went to visit the Opera Garnier twice over the course of this. That gave me new ideas. It was a long process, and it is why I am so excited that people can now read this story. So that is the history. I've already talked on quite a bit. Let me tell you another aspect, and then I'll get to some reading. So I did want to also talk about, it's a Phantom of the Opera retelling. Obviously, there are a lot of them out there. Why another one? Why is mine different? Those are the things that also typically get asked about this. So I really approached it with kind of 3 concepts, I would say. I don't know if I was quite conscious about this because, as I said, it was a multi-year, fairly intuitive process, but this is really when I try to think it through how I was approaching the story. So I already talked about Meg. Meg is one of the big ones of what is her perspective on this story and what is her story. As we know about these events that are happening, that we've read about them in LaRue, we've seen them in Weber, some variation of them. everyone is a little bit different. Mine is a little bit different, but some variation of these events. Well, what is also happening with Meg? What is her story in this, as this is all happening? And a lot of the book, more than half, I'm going to say, at least of book 1, is Meg's point of view. What is her take? What is her story on this? So that was concept 1. Concept 2 was, what if the Phantom is actually not crazy? And I don't mean that in any kind of like medical diagnosis way. I just mean the way that characters are sometimes just totally erratic, doing totally weird, random things, that kind of, book crazy. Because I feel like, and this is not just a Phantom thing, this is something that I've seen in other books. It's very easy to make your weird out there character who's doing really dramatic things like, I don't know, dropping chandeliers on crowds. Oh, well, they're just crazy. Or maybe they weren't crazy before, but then like something happened and they just lost it and they're just gonna do nutty things and that's what's happening and that's why they're doing these things. There is no reason. Or like there's maybe a little bit of a reason, but mostly they're just unhinged. Well, what if he's not? And I'm not gonna say ever that even my Phantom is totally normal and stable, and I mean, what is normal anyway, but you know what I'm getting at here. He's definitely got some things he's dealing with, but that's the idea. What is he dealing with? What actually leads a man to hide under an opera house and pretend to be a ghost for 7 years if he's not just completely unhinged? What is that? What is in his past that made this seem like a reasonable choice? Why would he drop a chandelier? I mean, it's a weird thing to do on many levels, obviously, but also he loves the opera house. Why is he doing this that's going to be so damaging? Why is he pretending to be an angel of music? That's kind of crazy when you actually stop and think about it. I mean, why would anyone believe that? And why would he think anyone would believe that? And what's really going on there? So, a more sane Phantom. He definitely he's complicated. Meg likes to say that he's complicated, but he has a rationale to what he is doing. He has motivations for what he's doing. And he's also not murderous and violent. He has a darker edge, for sure. But I feel like there are a lot of versions of the Phantom where he is murderous and violent, and the fans, I mean, and I'm one of them, I'm a fan, are like, well, we're going to kind of brush that part aside because we like this character and we can't square the murder with the character who's so sympathetic in so many other ways and we feel for him, and it's this really difficult thing to try and put those two together. So I'm like, okay, what if he has a darker edge but he's not a murderer? Let's just make him sympathetic. Let's not go like bending over backwards to make him sympathetic, but also he murdered someone. Let's just go with the sympathetic direction, which is not to say that he's not still complicated. I'm going to keep saying that. He's still got a dark edge. He's still carrying a lasso in his cloak. And I wouldn't really recommend crossing him in a big way, but he's not a cold-blooded murderer either. So that was concept 2. Concept 3. What if Christine is not exactly who we think she is? And I really don't want to say too much about this because spoilers. I'm going to do a separate video actually that does talk about this if you don't mind the spoilers and want to know. But what if Christine is not exactly who we think she is? What if she's not as passive? What if she knows what she's doing in some places? And I will get into more of this in a later video. But yeah, it's a different Christine too. She won't look like it necessarily right away, but keep reading and you're going to find out more about Christine. So that is how mine is different. I think it's a Phantom that I hope many fans want because I feel like we're trying to turn him into this kind of person anyway, even when the original book or retelling we're looking at doesn't make him this way. Meg is a new heroine with her own story, and it's not the Christine you've met before either. So I hope all of that adds up to something that you are curious to read. And I will now give you an excerpt. I'm going to have to put my glasses on. I usually don't film with glasses because I don't like how they reflect, but I do actually wear glasses most of the time in my life, and I need to be able to read. So I am actually not going to give you chapter 1, that scene I was talking about. It's on my blog, marveloustales.com, if you really want to read it before buying the book, because I trust you will buy the book too. I'm going to give you a scene that is actually chapter 7, because the first 5-6 chapters or so are earlier on. It's kind of background leading on to the story. And I'm going to give you the scene that introduces Christine. It's from Meg's point of view, and sort of the context is Bouquet died quite recently. The Phantom is staying undercover as a result of that, because the opera house is in a bit of an uproar. And Meg and her mother went to Box 5 after a performance. I mean, it's Madame Giry's job to be there. Meg went there to see Box 5 and to see her mother. And the Phantom did not come to the performance. And Meg is quite disappointed about that, because she thinks life is more exciting when he's around. But she doesn't know that something more exciting is about to come into her life. So she is leaving Box 5 as this scene opens, or the part that I'm reading. Mother held the door open, and I stepped out, nearly bumping directly into a girl about my age in the busy corridor outside. We exchanged quick, apologetic smiles. I watched her walk away while Mother locked Box 5 behind me. The girl's pink dress was nice, but not expensive enough for a guest. I didn't recognize her as part of the company, and I was sure I would remember her dramatic cluster of brown curls, so she had to be new. Lots of interesting things go on that have nothing to do with the Phantom, Mother said firmly, reclaiming my wandering attention. And you know that. Now go on to the dance foyer. Get to know some pleasant young man and stay out of trouble. I smiled wickedly. I can't do both. I would be worried if I thought you were serious. She quickly tidied my bangs, just as though I was still a child and not 17 years old, turned me around and gave me a light push towards the end of the corridor. Go ahead. I'll meet you to walk home after I finish with the other boxes. In the dance foyer, portraits of ballerinas smiled down on their living counterparts, while gold shone on the walls and on the girls' jewelry. It was mostly gilt, in both cases. The room was crowded with clusters of admiring men gathered around smiling dancers, standing about the room or claiming the green velvet banquettes along the walls. A wall of mirrors doubled the apparent size of the already large room, one of the opera's many tricks of illusion. A hum of voices and laughter rose from the crowd, a familiar hum that I enjoyed for its energy, its intrigue, its many stories unfolding all throughout the room. I smiled at Francesca when she caught my eye, raised a hand when Adelisa waved to me from another group. Maybe I'd go join them. But first I peered into the mirror, frowning at my smooth bangs. I could not convince Mother that rumpled hair was the fashion. I ran my fingertips through the strands, but my hair was just too straight to accomplish much. You needed curls for the right look. Like that girl right over there, just behind me and plainly visible in the mirror. It was the one from the corridor, with her artful brown curls piled on her head, loose strands wisping about her neck. Our glances met in the mirror almost at once, and I turned to face the real girl with a smile. Good evening. I'm sorry for nearly running you down before. I could go talk to any number of friends around the room, but I was curious about this probable new arrival. Oh, that's all right. Her long lashes made her brown eyes look even bigger as they widened. It was really my fault, hovering in front of the door. I couldn't decide which direction I ought to be going. This place is so confusing. I thought you might be new. I'm Meg Giry. Christine Daae. But how did you know I was new? With a light laugh, she indicated the crowded room around us. You can't recognize everyone. Or did I just look particularly lost? I know most people around here. And she wasn't the type to blend into the crowd. I had already noticed male glances turning our way, and I didn't bother telling myself that they were looking at me. I've been here for years. Don't worry, you'll get used to the place. She sighed, twisting her fingers together. I hope so. I remembered my own new days, all those years ago, and it felt nice being the one who belonged, who understood the world around us. Some girls arrived more confident than others, and this one seemed like she would need more help. Her posture, her anxious glances around the room, all suggested a lost uncertainty. Maybe I could give her some guidance if I knew more about her role here. What level of the ballet are you with? She was old enough for a leading position, but I didn't think she had one. Though she walked gracefully, she didn't move like Sorelli or the other premier ballerinas. The ballet? A tiny crease formed between her perfectly arched eyebrows as she frowned. Oh no, I'm in the chorus. I'm a soprano. A certain pride betrayed itself in her voice as she said it. And why not? Not many people could hit the notes sopranos did. All the same, she was far too tentative and hesitant for me to feel overawed by her singing status. If you're from the chorus, you're in the wrong foyer, I told her, trying not to laugh. The singers have a different reception room than the ballet. Really? She threw her hands in the air, a gesture that should have seemed theatrical yet looked natural from her. You see, hopelessly confused. I did laugh then, because it felt more like a shared joke than like I was mocking her. Don't worry, I won't tell anyone you don't belong. No one's likely to notice, and nothing too awful will happen even if they do. I pointed toward an empty banquette. Let's snatch that before some duke sits down, and you can tell me when you got here. Christine had been at the Opera Garnier for 4 days. The very next thing I learned was that her father was a wonderful violinist who had died 3 years ago, leaving her alone in the world. He'd always dreamed she could be a great singer, so she had studied at the Paris Conservatoire, and now she was here. I told her that I was originally from Leclerc, a village in the south of France, but I had been at the opera for 5 years with my mother, one of the box keepers. I thought your name sounded familiar, Christine said, and that tiny crease appeared between her brows again. Suddenly her forehead cleared, and she said, Isn't your mother the Phantom's box keeper? For several years now, I said with a nod. That was mostly how Mother was known at the opera these days. Sometimes I enjoyed the association. Sometimes it annoyed me that no one seemed to care much for anything else about us. But that wasn't Christine's fault, if she had happened to hear the story. Christine shivered. Don't you find it alarming? I've heard so many horrible stories about the Phantom since I came here. Walls dripping with blood and disembodied heads, no doubt. You sort of get used to him. It's exciting, really. It was bad enough that he'd apparently gone away for a while. I couldn't imagine the Opera Garnier permanently without its resident ghost. He was the opera's spirit, in more ways than one. And I think I will stop there. They go on to talk about the Phantom. We hear a little more of what Meg thinks of the Phantom and what Christine learns as a result. And the two of them become friends. So I hope you buy the book. Find out what happens next. Find out what happened before, too. That was chapter 7. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight on the book. And I'm going to answer a few questions as well that people have asked about it. You can absolutely read my book without already knowing the Phantom of the Opera story. So I wrote it wanting to make it clear and understandable to people who do not already know how the story works and know who the characters are. In some ways, I think you'll have a slightly different impression possibly because you will accept the world as I tell it to you. And some of what I've written is with the idea in mind that people have a concept, and I want to slowly bring you around to believing the different way that I am telling the story. So if you don't already have any concepts here and you're coming in blank slate, in some ways it almost might be easier. Easier isn't really the right word. I assume you're just going to accept the world as you find it. If you do actually know the story, it's not like that's a disadvantage. You're not going to be confused by what I've written. I think I've actually done more to try to make it clear for people who think they know what's happening, and things might be different. So whether you know the story really, really well or don't know it at all, I think it will work for you. It may just be a little bit different with how surprised you may be by some things in this. So there are 2 covers. I still have my advanced reader copy. I promise when you buy it, it will not have that stripe on it. This is the paperback cover, and this is the hardback cover. So I actually did the cover design for both of these in my not writing day job, pay the bills job. I actually do a lot with Photoshop and graphic design. So I did my own covers, which was really fun because I could make it the way I wanted it. And I found a ballet dancer model that I really liked for Meg. I had to make the Phantom's eyes a little bit greener because the green eyes of the Phantom are definitely part of the story, but he's looming up there. And then the opera house back there, I actually took that photo myself one time when I was visiting the Opera Garnier. So that is the cover with Meg, the opera house, and the Phantom, which is kind of my 3 principal characters in a way. I am not showing covers for books 2 and 3 yet, but I think when you see them all together, I have designed all 3 of them. They coordinate very nicely, I think. So I'm excited to get to the point where I can share the other covers. But for now, this is the cover for book 1. That was the paperback. This is the hardback. Obviously, this is a much simpler cover. sort of classic and basic with the musical notes on the black background. Those are actually the musical notes that represent the Phantom. Inside of the book, there is scene breaks for, depending on who the point of view character is, there's a different symbol. So that is Meg. You can see the ballet dancer sitting there. That indicates the following scene is from Meg's point of view. And here are those musical notes. Gonna try and bring those up to the camera. Those indicate it's the Phantom. I thought about doing a mask, but I'm like, I don't really want him symbolized by a mask. I want him symbolized by his music. So that is the music that is on the cover of the hardback. It actually is on the back cover of the paperback as well. So those are the two different cover designs, and I was pretty happy with both of them. I hope you will also enjoy them with your copies. So there's really two different approaches to the research, I would say, when you're retelling the Phantom of the Opera, and I pretty much went down both paths. One is to research other versions of the Phantom, because there are so many of them. The other is to research the time and the place, Paris 1880s, the Opera Garnier specifically. And I really explored both of those things. I have done other videos about the many versions of the Phantom of the Opera that I have read or seen, and my version is not any of their versions, but they definitely all brought interesting things to the story and to the characters and sparked some ideas or made me think about some nuances or made me think, oh, the way they're doing that is really cool. I wonder what I can do for mine that is not the same, but it's interesting. So I did a lot of research down the path of the Phantom of the Opera, and also noticing things from like, that doesn't really make sense how they're telling that. What can I do in mind to explain why things are happening the way they are? So there were a lot of those ideas too. That's what I do with retelling, is try to explain the things that don't make sense. The other path, as I said, is to actually go into the history, as well as the ballet and the classical music for the Phantom. And I read a lot of books for that also. I read a lot of books about the Opera Garnier. I read a lot of books about Paris of the time period. And interestingly, you can get some very interesting essays about the Opera Garnier in the introductions to copies of the Phantom of the Opera. So that was a useful source. I read a few different introductory essays about the Opera Garnier in copies of Leroux's Phantom. I also read a very good book, Marie Dancing. It's a historical fiction novel about a ballet dancer at the Opera Garnier in 1881, which is exactly when my book is set. It's the model for Degas' statue, Marie Dancing. So totally different than my story, but she's inhabiting the same world that my book is also in. And I really wanted to incorporate some of the historical context I think is often not noticed or included in versions of the Phantom of the Opera. So, I was doing that research with the Phantom stories and noticing, they're not thinking about some of this historical stuff that I'm also researching. For example, the class distinction between Raoul and Christine is usually completely ignored, but historically it would have been there. So if you really want to know details about what research I did, I put 2 pages on the back about some of the sources that I read into, if you would like to read more, because it's actually hard to find information and I had to do some digging. So I'm like, if someone else wants to know more, I'm going to tell them the things that I found. So I visited the Opera Garnier, the real life one in Paris, twice over the course of the writing, and it definitely gave me some ideas because it was the first time it really felt like a real, tangible place. When you read Leroux, it's just kind of this endless labyrinthine building that goes on forever. It is a world unto itself, which it still kind of is in my book, but that's in a more metaphorical sense. Being there in person made me realize, oh, it's a building. You can walk all the way around it. It's not actually endless. The Louvre was kind of endless, but the Opera Garnier is comparatively contained. So I think that influenced how I created the setting. Definitely some of the principal rooms that we see throughout the book are rooms that were on the tour. They're also the most striking, most impressive places. I mean, the auditorium, the grand stair, the grand foyer. There's a reason they're on the tour. There's a reason they're in the story. It's slightly overlapping, but I learned some interesting details about the Opera House as well that did work their way in. The grand foyer, a lot of the gold is actually paint. I love that because it's a theater, it's illusion. That shows up a couple of times, I think in book 2 and 3. So knowing it was a real building and an actual tangible space, I think did influence some of the ways I set the story, some of the ways I regarded the characters. And there is a choice that Christine makes well into the book that I won't spoil, but being there made me think about her choice a little bit differently and realize, there's something a little strange about this. But you will have to read the book to find out more about that. So I would recommend reading them in order. They stand alone in the sense that they are complete books, but book 2 does follow from book 1, book 3 follows from book 2. My previous series, the Beyond the Tales Quartet, was meant to stand completely alone. You can read them in any order, it does not matter. That's not how this trilogy is. They are meant to be read in order because it is a continuing story and a continuing arc of the characters. I wrote them out of order, but you probably shouldn't read them out of order.